Welcome to Teaching Truth. Landmarks in the Law. The book written by the late and eminent Lord Denning about significant cases down through English legal history. A fascinating book to read. And had there been a documentation of cases throughout the time of the early church, the trial of the Apostle Paul would undoubtedly have featured in such a book, Landmarks in the Law. In our final reflection today, as we look at our theme, Landmarks in the Law, as we look at the trial of the Apostle Paul, we want to look at the favour that was shown towards Paul, the favour that was shown towards Paul. All throughout his trial, God's hand was upon Paul, and God was orchestrating all those involved in the trial of Paul for his plan and for his purposes. And as we read the book of Acts 24 and 25, we see that Paul is brought before Agrippa. Now, Agrippa comes from the family of Herod, and he was by birth a Jew, that is, Agrippa. He was the son of Herod Agrippa, who himself was the grandson of Herod the Great. And Agrippa had grown up in common with his countrymen with a full belief in the inspiration of the sacred writings and under a firm conviction that Messiah, a messenger from God, would come to the nation. And therefore, and because of that, Agrippa listened with more respect and deference than an ordinary Roman would have done. And the arguments which Paul put forward had more effect on his mind, that is, Agrippa's mind, than they could have been expected to have on the mind of Festus or Felix. And Paul, being Paul, did not waste the opportunity to share his testimony with Agrippa, with the important people. Paul never missed a chance. He told them about his formal education, his strict adherence to Jewish law, and his campaign against Christians. Remember the stoning of Stephen? Before he eventually encountered Jesus. In other words, he shared his testimony, his life story, and the transformation that Jesus had had on his life, to the extent that Agrippa then said to Paul, "Do you think that in such a short time you can persuade me to become a Christian? Do you think in such a short time you can persuade me to become a Christian?" Well, as far as we know, Agrippa was almost persuaded. Almost persuaded. And some modern day Agrippas are almost persuaded, but sometimes are hesitant about making that step of commitment, because they favour comfort and culture over commitment. We, like Paul, are to be faithful, not to force, but we are to be faithful and to leave the Holy Spirit to do the rest. Agrippa paused. We don't know whether or not he ever became a Christian. Certainly in the New Testament narrative, there is no indication that he did. But the seed had been sown by Paul and by his good confession and testimony and the sharing of his life story into Agrippa's life. Paul, it was agreed, had to be sent to Rome, to the supreme court, as it were, of the day. enter Julius. Who was Julius? Well, Julius was the Roman officer in charge, and in a very short space of time, he trusted Paul. He trusted Paul and cared enough for him to let him see his friends and to allow his friends to tend to his needs. Great kindness and respect on the arduous trip to Rome was shown. Paul practiced what he preached. Acts 27 verses 1 to 3. The next day we landed at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul with human kindness and permitted him to go to his friends and enjoy their care. Just why Julius, this Roman officer, was moved to show such kindness to Paul is not stated. We don't know the reason. He could well have been under orders from Governor Festus to give Paul special treatment. Or perhaps having been familiar with the circumstances of Paul's arrest, he may simply have admired Paul's courage and integrity. But in any event, Julius seemed to appreciate that Paul was no ordinary prisoner. As we read through the story of their sailing to Rome, Julius chose eventually to listen to Paul. Paul said, "Unless these men remain in the boat, you cannot be saved." He stood up and assured the frightened passengers that not a soul of them would be lost, only the boat. The ship ran aground and was wrecked. Fearful that the prisoners would escape, the soldiers on board determined to kill all of them. But what happened? Julius intervened and restrained his men, thus saving Paul's life. Julius had been moved to show kindness to Paul, this Roman soldier, this Roman officer in charge. He intervened. God, I believe, was using Julius. Well, the Bible doesn't tell us what became of this kind centurion or whether he ever embraced the Christian faith. But whatever kindness he showed was a demonstration of the workings of a God-given conscience. Again, Paul, because of his good confession, because of his testimony, because of his good relationship, had won a friend in Julius, and therefore Julius was kind to Paul. He had shown favour to Paul. May we be like Julius. May we be kind and gentle and gracious and protective of others who come into our care, who, as it were, come into our boat on the journey of life. The trial of Paul was a landmark in the law of the early church. And all through it, God was in absolute control because God had a plan and a purpose for Paul, even through the trials that he had. Well, Paul sets sail for Rome. Paul encounters a storm, and Paul, along with others, is shipwrecked on the beach in Malta. And that's where we'll join him next week for our final set of reflections as we unpack the exciting and challenging book of Acts together. God bless you.